$7.50 a week. That is where this empire began. Not in a mahogany-clad boardroom on Wall Street, but in the chemical-stained hands of a young PhD from the prestigious University of Göttingen. John Thompson Dorrance didn't just cook soup. He used chemistry to strip away the water, concentrate the flavor, and distill raw power. But the legacy Dorrance left behind was more than just the comforting warmth of a family meal. It was a golden shackle. When he passed away in 1930, he left a 35-page will with an ironclad command: never sell the stock. That curse ignited a vicious tax war between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, forcing the family to pay a record $26 million for a lie about where the patriarch truly lived. It turned his descendants into prisoners of their own wealth, from his son Jack, who lived in constant fear of kidnappers, to grandchildren worth billions who remained haunted by the ghost of their ancestors' ambition. We follow Ippy Dorrance, the grandson who inherited a staggering fortune but chose to renounce his American citizenship, fleeing to the emerald fields of Ireland in a desperate search for freedom. We will witness a dynasty, once at the pinnacle of unity, fragmenting across 3 continents, caught in a tug-of-war between individual desire and the duty to preserve a fading empire. From a simple chemical formula to a $15 billion multinational driven by AI, this is a saga of iron-willed ambition, laboratory secrets, and the suffocating price of a bloodline imprisoned within those iconic red and white cans. Welcome to the Epic of Campbell's, an empire of condensed curses. To understand the weight of this empire, we must travel back to a time before the billions, before the fame, to a dusty canning plant in Camden, New Jersey, where soup was anything but a household staple. The history of American industry is often told through the lens of gargantuan titans, men who built steel mills, oil refineries, or sprawling railroads that carved through the heart of the continent. Yet, one of the most profound revolutions in the American kitchen began not with a master chef or a culinary visionary, but with a laboratory-trained chemist who viewed food as a problem of molecular efficiency. Before the iconic red and white label became a permanent fixture of global culture and a cornerstone of the American pantry, the Joseph Campbell Preserve Company was a modest, struggling regional cannery in Camden, New Jersey. Founded in 1869 by Joseph Campbell, a humble fruit merchant, and Abraham Anderson, an icebox manufacturer, the firm was a relic of the old-world canning model. They produced a dizzying, scattered, and fundamentally inefficient array of products: tomatoes, peas, jellies, mincemeat, and various condiments. It was a business defined by razor-thin margins and massive overhead, perpetually subject to the whims of seasonal harvests and local market demand. When Campbell retired in 1894 and Arthur Dorrance took the helm, the company was a regional success story, yet it lacked a global engine. It was profitable, but it was stagnant, a local entity waiting for a spark of genius to ignite its potential. The catalyst for this seismic change arrived in 1897 in the form of Arthur's nephew, John Thompson Dorrance, a brilliant young man who had recently earned his PhD in organic chemistry from the prestigious University of Göttingen in Germany. John was a figure of rare academic and restless intellect. In an era when most food production was guided by century-old traditions and mere guesswork, John brought the cold, analytical gaze of German scientific rigor to the industrial floor. During his time in Europe, he had performed a crucial piece of market research that others had overlooked. He observed a fundamental cultural discrepancy between the old world and the new. In Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, soup was an essential daily staple for all social classes. In America, however, commercially prepared soup was either a luxury for the wealthy or a laborious, time-consuming homemade chore for the working class. John's genius was not located in the secret seasoning of a recipe, but in the cold mathematics of logistics. He recognized that the primary obstacle to soup's mass adoption in the United States was what he termed the tyranny of water. At the dawn of the 20th century, canned soup was sold in large, heavy 32-ounce cans. Because soup is predominantly composed of water, the industry was essentially paying exorbitant amounts to ship, store, and shelf tap water. This made the final product prohibitively expensive, roughly 30 cents a can, which was a significant sum for a working-class family in 1897, often equivalent to several hours of labor. John realized that if he could use chemistry to remove the water at the point of manufacture, He could shrink the physical can by 2/3, slash the shipping costs by half, and pass those monumental savings directly onto the consumer. It was the birth of condensed soup, a concept that would redefine the economics of the grocery shelf. When John approached his Uncle Arthur with this radical vision, he was met with deep skepticism. Arthur, a practical man of the previous generation, saw no place for a highly educated chemist in the grimy, steam-filled environment of a canning plant. To prove his unwavering commitment, John made a move that remains a legend in corporate history. He declined prestigious professorships at Cornell, Columbia, and even Göttingen to work for a pittance of just $7.50 per week. He even agreed to fund his own laboratory equipment out of his personal savings. This wasn't a mere sacrifice, it was a high-stakes strategic investment. By starting at the very bottom, John was able to re-engineer the entire production process from the molecular level up, away from the interference of traditionalists who clung to the old, bloated canning methods. The first 2 years were a masterclass in industrial optimization. John experimented tirelessly with tomato formulas, seeking the perfect balance of acidity, sugar content, and solids that could withstand the high heat condensation process without losing its vibrant flavor profile. By 1899, he had perfected the formula, creating a product that was stable, nutritious, and incredibly flavorful. The financial results of this engineering were staggering. By removing the unnecessary water, he reduced the weight and volume of the can so drastically that Campbell's could price their product at a revolutionary 10 cents a dime. This was the Henry Ford moment for the food industry, standardizing a high-quality product at a price so low that competitors, still shipping heavy cans of water, simply could not survive the price war. John Thompson Dorrance was no longer just a scientist. He was an industrialist in the making. The technological breakthrough of 1897 was only the first half of John Thompson Dorrance's master plan. While the world saw a revolutionary 10-cent can of condensed soup, John saw a clear path to total industrial sovereignty. He understood a fundamental truth of capitalism that many inventors overlook. A brilliant formula is only as powerful as the hands that hold the equity. John was not content with being a clever nephew or a high-paid executive. He intended to be the sole master of the industrial behemoth he was painstakingly creating. This second phase of his rise was marked by a ruthless financial condensation, systematically buying out anyone who stood between him and absolute, unquestioned control of the company's future. By the early 1900s, the company's growth was nothing short of astronomical. Annual production had jumped from a few 100,000 cans to an incredible 16 million. The massive profits generated by his chemical breakthrough became John's primary weapon in a quiet war for ownership. Unlike other heirs of the Gilded Age who might have spent their dividends on European art or summer cottages in Newport, John lived with a calculated, almost monastic frugality. He reinvested every single cent of his earnings to claw back ownership from the original partners of the Joseph Campbell Preserve Company. One by one, he used his increasing leverage and the undeniable, skyrocketing success of the condensed line to convince shareholders that the company's value was entirely dependent on his presence. His message to the board was unspoken but chillingly clear. I am the technology. I am the formula. Without me, you are just fruit merchants again. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a strategic reality. John had patented the processes and held the trade secrets in his head. If he walked away, the company would collapse back into its mediocre, regional roots. Leveraging this power, he systematically targeted the shares held by his Uncle Arthur's original partners. He was moving with a surgical precision, consolidating his grip year after year. John's management style reflected this desire for total control. He abolished the inefficient committee style of decision-making that had hindered the company's agility in its early years. In John's view, a corporation was a laboratory, and in a laboratory, there can be only one lead scientist. He insisted on overseeing every minute detail, from the specific nitrate levels in the New Jersey soil where the tomatoes were grown to the exact font size on the new advertisements. This obsession with quality was a calculated business move. He was creating a brand so standardized and reliable that it acted as its own marketing force. In 1898, persuaded by executive Herberton L. Williams, the company adopted the vibrant red and white label, inspired by the Cornell football team's uniforms. He knew that this visual identity would become a social contract with the American housewife, a promise of purity and value in an era of unregulated, often dangerous, food products. The final consolidation of power occurred between 1914 and 1915. Arthur Dorrance finally retired, and John Thompson Dorrance officially assumed the presidency. Shortly thereafter, he achieved a feat that few industrial titans ever managed. He bought out the last remaining interests, including the final shares held by the original Campbell family. At age 42, the man who had entered the factory for a mere $7.50 a week now owned 100% of the Campbell Soup Company. The young chemist who started for $7.50 a week was now the sole master of an empire. However, this total victory came with a profound and dark psychological shift. John began to view the company not just as a business, but as a biological extension of the Dorrance bloodline. He viewed outside investors and public markets with a paranoia that bordered on the pathological, fearing that any external influence would dilute the purity of his vision. This sparked the creation of the golden shackle that would bind his descendants for nearly a century. He was constructing a private empire where loyalty to the family was synonymous with loyalty to the firm. As he walked through his sprawling plants in Camden, he began drafting the initial concepts of a 35-page will designed to ensure that no one, not even his own children, could ever sell what he had built. He had successfully condensed an entire industry into a single can, but in doing so, he was preparing to condense the lives of 4 generations into a single, unyielding command. By the year 1915, John Thompson Dorrance had successfully transitioned from a brilliant chemist in a blood-stained laboratory apron to the absolute, undisputed monarch of a burgeoning canned food empire. Having meticulously executed a series of financial maneuvers to buy out every remaining partner and the original Campbell family, he held 100% of the company's equity. This total ownership was not merely a trophy of vanity. It was the essential prerequisite for John to implement a corporate strategy characterized by a singular, ruthless focus, simplification for the sake of total domination. In the company's formative years, it had functioned as a chaotic generalist, packing an inefficient and dizzying array of products, from fruit jellies and sweet jams to savory mincemeat and assorted condiments. John, with his scientific mind, viewed this diversity as a toxic drain on corporate resources and a dilution of the brand's potential. He systematically executed what internal historians call a product purge, eliminating every single production line that did not directly contribute to the condensed soup category. He famously articulated a philosophy that would become a cornerstone of modern business management. A company attempting to master 10 different things would eventually master none. Campbell would do one thing, soup, and it would do it with a level of industrial efficiency and chemical precision that the world had never before witnessed. This era marked the profound transformation of Campbell's from a regional New Jersey curiosity into a truly nationwide industrial powerhouse. The logistical challenges inherent in this expansion were staggering. In the early 1910s, the task of distributing a perishable food product across the vast 3,000-mile expanse of the United States, through nascent rail lines, primitive cold storage, and a fragmented network of wholesalers, was considered a fool's errand for a medium-sized firm. Most competitors were content to remain local kings. John, however, viewed geography not as a barrier, but as a chemistry problem of scale and concentration. By 1911, he achieved a milestone that sent shockwaves through the industry. Campbell's Soup successfully reached the California coast in pristine condition. This was far more than a sales achievement. It was a triumph of supply chain engineering. John established a sophisticated network of strategically located regional warehouses and used his immense volume to negotiate unprecedented freight rates with the era's railroad magnates. He possessed a unique competitive advantage. Because his condensed soup cans were physically 1/3 the size of his competitors' water-heavy products, he could ship 3 times the caloric value in the same rail car. He was quite literally weaponizing his chemical breakthrough to win a war of transportation and shelf space dominance. To maintain the 10-cent dime price point, which John regarded as the psychological bedrock of his empire's mass appeal, he recognized that he had to control the cost and quality of raw materials with an iron fist. This realization led to one of the earliest and most successful implementations of vertical integration in American history. John Dorrance did not want to merely purchase tomatoes from the open market. He wanted to control the very genetic makeup of the fruit. In 1912, he launched a massive, well-funded agricultural research program that functioned more like a biotech firm than a farming operation. He recruited the nation's top agronomists to develop specific tomato hybrids designed for the factory, fruits with thicker skins to survive bumpy rail transport and a significantly higher solid-to-liquid ratio to optimize the condensation process. He established company farms and entered into ironclad contracts with thousands of independent farmers across the New Jersey Garden State, providing them with proprietary seeds and mandating strict chemical protocols for fertilizers and pest control. During the intense, sweltering 8-week summer harvest, the Camden plant became a high-velocity, 24-hour machine, processing millions of pounds of these engineered tomatoes into a concentrated base that would fuel the nation's pantry for the rest of the year. John had effectively turned the New Jersey landscape into a biological extension of his factory floor, ensuring that every link in the chain, from the seed to the spoon, was under his direct supervision. As the company's coffers swelled to unimaginable levels, John's stature within the American social establishment rose in tandem. He was no longer the experimenting nephew that the senior Dorrance family once feared would bankrupt the firm. He was now a titan of industry, a man whose counsel was sought in the mahogany-clad boardrooms of powerful banks and sprawling railroad conglomerates. In 1906, his marriage to Ethel Mallinckrodt, a woman of impeccable pedigree from a prominent Baltimore family, had solidified his entry into the social elite of the eastern seaboard. However, this rapid ascent into the highest echelons of society created a profound internal conflict, a psychological double life that would eventually sow the seeds of the family's greatest legal and financial catastrophe. John Thompson Dorrance was a man whose heart belonged to the industrial efficiency of the New Jersey factory, but whose ego craved the Pennsylvania prestige. He respected the grimy productivity of Camden, but he desired the aristocratic, old money air of the Philadelphia main line. This psychological tug-of-war manifested most clearly in his real estate and tax strategies. While the heart of the Campbell Empire remained anchored in the industrial smoke and noise of Camden, John began eyeing the rolling, emerald hills of Radnor, Pennsylvania. He understood that in the Gilded Age, where a man lived defined his social brand and determined the future of his children's marriages and social standing. Yet John's analytical mind was always calculating the reaction. He knew that Pennsylvania's inheritance and estate tax laws were predatory compared to the far more lenient statutes of New Jersey. If he were to officially move his legal residence across the river, he would be essentially handing a massive percentage of his hard-earned empire to the Pennsylvania state authorities upon his death. This financial reality birthed the Great Deception. John resolved that he would live like a Pennsylvania king in a 51-room mansion, while meticulously maintaining the legal fiction that he was a simple resident of a modest New Jersey farmhouse. He was attempting to apply the same scientific principles of condensation to his very identity, trying to pack the maximum amount of social status into the minimum possible tax liability. He was a master of formulas, but he was about to discover that the law, unlike chemistry, is often driven by human emotion and political greed rather than predictable molecular reactions. By 1925, the financial profile of John Thompson Dorrance had reached a state of almost surreal accumulation. He was no longer merely wealthy. He was generating liquidity at a rate that outpaced the capacity of any single human to consume. His Campbell Soup Company had become a money printing machine, fueled by a 10-cent product that sat in nearly every pantry in the United States. However, John's obsession with molecular efficiency, the very principle that made his soup a success, now began to warp his personal life. He sought to acquire the ultimate symbol of American aristocratic status, a grand estate on the Philadelphia main line. He chose Woodcrest, a 238-acre masterpiece of Elizabethan and Tudor Revival architecture in Radnor, Pennsylvania. It was a 51-room fortress of limestone and timber, a residence designed to broadcast power, lineage, and permanence. But for John, Woodcrest was not just a home. It was a high-stakes laboratory for a social and fiscal experiment. The purchase of Woodcrest for $1 million, an astronomical sum in the mid-1920s, was only the beginning of an elaborate, decade-long performance. John moved his entire family, his 16 servants, and his 5 children into the Radnor mansion. He enrolled his children in the most prestigious Pennsylvania private schools and integrated himself into the elite social fabric of the main line. His wife, Ethel, transformed Woodcrest into a hub of high society galas and garden parties that were breathlessly chronicled in the society pages. To any casual observer, John Dorrance was a prominent citizen of Pennsylvania. But in the cold ledgers of his mind, John remained a legal ghost. He understood that Pennsylvania's inheritance taxes were significantly higher than those of New Jersey. To protect his $120 million fortune from being diluted by the state after his death, he meticulously maintained the fiction that his primary residence was still a modest, ordinary, and very ugly farmhouse in Cinnaminson, New Jersey. This deception was managed with the same industrial precision John applied to his tomato farms. To bolster the legal illusion, he ensured that his voter registration, his driver's license, and his primary banking remained anchored in New Jersey. He instructed his attorneys to draft a will that explicitly declared him a resident of Cinnaminson. But the most chilling manifestation of this great deception was found in the mundane details of his utility bills. While Woodcrest required $90,000 a year to maintain its sprawling grandeur, the New Jersey farmhouse was kept on a starvation diet of resources. Internal records would later reveal a detail that became a landmark of corporate hubris. The New Jersey farmhouse remained a skeletal residence, lacking the staff, the social activity, and the utility consumption of a true home, serving only as a paper fortress to deceive the tax authorities. He was a man who owned a 51-room mansion but claimed to live a life powered by the energy of a few light bulbs in a shack. It was the ultimate condensed life, trying to shrink his legal footprint to avoid a tax bill, while his social footprint expanded into the stratosphere. This obsessive need for control was not limited to tax avoidance. It extended to the very structure of his company's future. Throughout the late 1920s, as the stock market roared, investment bankers from Wall Street frequently made the pilgrimage to Camden, their mouths watering at the prospect of taking Campbell Soup public. They envisioned a massive IPO that would value the company at hundreds of millions. John, however, rebuffed every single overture. He refused to even grant them a meeting. He craved no outside ownership, no external scrutiny, and no public interference. To John, a public company was a compromised company. He wanted the Campbell Soup Company to remain a private extension of his own will, an ironclad dynasty that would outlast him by a century. He was building a golden shackle, a corporate structure so rigid that it would eventually become a cage for his own children. As he presided over his 51-room kingdom in Radnor, drinking heavily in the quiet evenings, a habit that would tragically haunt the Dorrance lineage, John began the final stage of his masterwork, the drafting of his 35-page will. This document was the ultimate distillation of his ambition. It wasn't just a plan for the distribution of wealth, it was a manual for posthumous control. He designed a system where his only son, Jack, would be favored, but also burdened. He created a legal mechanism that essentially forbade the sale of Campbell's stock, binding his heirs to the company regardless of their personal desires or the changing tides of the economy. He was 56 years old, at the absolute apex of his influence, convinced that he had outsmarted both the taxman and the passage of time. He believed he had found the perfect formula for an eternal empire. He was unknowingly teetering on the precipice of a collapse that would prove that while you can condense soup, you cannot condense the consequences of a lifetime of deception. The end of John Thompson. Dorrance came not with a grand industrial flourish, but with a quiet, almost poetic irony. On September 21, 1930, at the age of 56, the same age at which he was arguably the most powerful food industrialist on the planet, his heart finally gave out. In a final, desperate act to maintain the great deception he had spent a decade crafting, John did not die in the 51-room splendor of Woodcrest in Pennsylvania. Instead, he passed away in the ordinary and very ugly farmhouse in Cinnaminson, New Jersey. He had retreated there during the late summer, ostensibly to oversee the tomato harvests at the company's experimental farms. But in reality, he was there to fortify his legal claim of residency. He died in the very place he had spent years pretending to live in, a man literally killed by the exhaustion of his own double life. He left behind a grieving family, a massive corporate vacuum, and a 35-page will that would soon become the most scrutinized document in American probate history. The news of his death sent a shockwave through the financial corridors of New York and Philadelphia, but the real earthquake occurred in the tax offices of two competing states. John's executors, following his ironclad instructions to the letter, immediately filed his will for probate in Burlington County, New Jersey. They declared him a lifelong resident of the Garden State, a move intended to secure the lower inheritance tax rate he had so meticulously planned for. However, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was not about to let a $120 million fortune slip across the Delaware River without a fight. Pennsylvania tax authorities had been watching the Dorrance family for years. They had monitored the grand galas at Woodcrest, the enrollment of the Dorrance children in elite Radnor schools, and the sheer scale of the family's social integration into the Philadelphia main line. They saw through the $7 electricity bill in New Jersey and recognized it for what it was, a fraudulent facade. What followed was a landmark legal conflict known as Henry Dorrance's estate, a case that would redefine the concept of domicile in American law. Pennsylvania moved with predatory speed, asserting that John Dorrance had been a legal resident of Radnor since the moment he moved into Woodcrest in 1925. They appointed a phalanx of investigators to strip away the layers of John's deception. These investigators performed a forensic audit of his lifestyle that was as precise as John's own chemical formulas. They didn't just look at his driver's license, they looked at the coal deliveries to Woodcrest versus the wood-burning stoves in Cinnaminson. They interviewed servants, neighbors, and delivery boys. They proved that while John's paper trail was in New Jersey, his life trail was in Pennsylvania. The state's argument was devastatingly simple. A man's home is where his heart, his family, and his daily habits reside, not where he keeps a dusty mailbox for the sake of the taxman. The legal battle escalated to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, where the justices delivered a stinging rebuke to Dorrance's strategy. They famously ruled that acts speak louder than words. The court pointed to the staggering discrepancy in living expenses, $90,000 a year to run Woodcrest versus a mere $6,000 to keep the Cinnaminson house standing. They concluded that a person's desire to retain a domicile cannot supersede the physical reality of their actual residence. Pennsylvania successfully claimed over $14 million in inheritance taxes. It was a staggering blow, but the true nightmare for the Dorrance heirs was only just beginning. In a move that defined the term double taxation, the state of New Jersey refused to back down. Armed with the very paper trail John had so carefully constructed, his voter registration, his New Jersey-based bank accounts, and the headquarters of Campbell Soup in Camden, New Jersey, asserted its own sovereign right to tax the estate. They argued that Pennsylvania's ruling was not binding on them. The executors found themselves caught in a terrifying vice. They appealed to the United States Supreme Court, pleading that a man cannot die in two places at once for the privilege of being taxed twice. But in a decision that still haunts estate planners today, Justice Louis Brandeis and the High Court declined to intervene. They ruled that each state had the sovereign power to determine domicile according to its own laws. The final bill for John's condensed life was catastrophic. Pennsylvania collected $14 million. New Jersey, refusing to be outdone, collected over $12 million. With interest and legal fees, the family was forced to pay a combined total of nearly $30 million, roughly double what they would have paid if John had simply been honest about his residency in either state. The man who had spent his life removing unnecessary water from his products to save money had, in the end, added a massive, unnecessary tax burden to his own bloodline through the water of his own deception. The Dorrance case became a chilling precedent, a stark warning that in the eyes of the law, the formula for a home cannot be faked with a $7 electricity bill. As the family liquidated assets to pay the staggering debt, they realized that the patriarch's 35-page will was not just a gift, but a set of golden handcuffs that were already starting to chafe. The $30 million tax bill was a staggering blow, but in the cold, calculated world of John Thompson Dorrance, it was merely the cost of a failed experiment. The true, enduring legacy of his ambition lay not in the cash he lost to the government, but in the 35-page document that remained, his will. This was not a standard legal instrument for the distribution of assets. It was a comprehensive manual for posthumous micromanagement. John Sr. had spent his life removing distractions from his company, and through this will, he attempted to remove human error from his family's future. He viewed his descendants not as individuals with their own aspirations, but as biological trustees of the Campbell Soup Company. The will was designed to ensure that the condensed empire would remain a private, family-owned fortress, regardless of whether the heirs were capable of or interested in running it. The most restrictive clause in the document was the never sell mandate. John explicitly instructed his executors and heirs that the stock of the Campbell Soup Company was never to be sold unless under circumstances of the greatest deliberation, a legal phrase so vague yet so daunting that it effectively paralyzed any attempt at liquidation for decades. He stipulated that if a sale were ever to occur, the shares must be sold in one unified, massive block. This was a strategic poison pill designed to prevent dilution. John feared that if his 4 daughters or his son started selling small parcels of stock to fund their lifestyles, outside investors or Wall Street sharks would eventually gobble up enough shares to challenge the family's absolute rule. He preferred his heirs to be asset-rich but cash-constrained prisoners of the company rather than wealthy individuals with the freedom to diversify their interests. The will also reflected John's rigid, patriarchal view of lineage. While his wife Ethel and his 4 daughters received substantial portions of the estate, the lion's share of executive potential and the double allotment of future stock were reserved for the male line E, specifically for his only son, John Jr., known as Jack. At just 11 years old, Jack was thrust into a role that was part prince, part prisoner. The press, sensing the drama of a child inheriting one of the world's largest private fortunes during the depths of the Great Depression, dubbed him the reigning Earl of Soup. While other children his age were playing in the streets, Jack was being groomed to be the steward of a 35-page set of ironclad commands. He inherited not just a quarter of the company, but his father's extensive library and a grandfather clock, symbols of the weight of history and the relentless ticking of a clock that he was now expected to manage. This golden shackle created an immediate and profound psychological burden. The Dorrance children were raised with the understanding that they did not own their wealth. They were merely guarding it for the next generation of Dorrances. This created a culture of extreme privacy and paranoia. Because the company remained private and the family held almost all the equity, they were constantly terrified of kidnappers and fortune hunters. Jack, in particular, grew up in the shadow of a father who had outsmarted everyone but death. The 35-page will effectively froze the family in time. They were forbidden from diversifying their wealth, meaning their entire standard of living was tied to the performance of a single product: condensed soup. If the American public ever stopped eating soup, the Dorrance dynasty would collapse. This all-in strategy, forced from the grave, meant that the family had to be more conservative, more protective, and more secretive than any of their peers on the main line. By 1935, as the dust from the tax wars settled, the Campbell Soup Company emerged as a paradox of American capitalism. It was a multi-million-dollar industrial giant, yet it was governed like a medieval fiefdom by a document written by a dead man. The executors, led by John's brother Arthur, managed the company with a preservationist mindset, taking no risks that might jeopardize the family's grip. This rigid adherence to the 1930 will ensured stability during the Depression, but it also planted the seeds of future obsolescence. The world was changing, but the Dorrance family was legally obligated to remain exactly as John Sr. had left them. Jack Dorrance, the 11-year-old heir, began his long wait in the Gilded Cage, a young boy who owned an empire, but was forbidden by a 35-page ghost from ever truly calling it his own. While John Thompson Dorrance Sr. was the volatile scientific genius who forged the Campbell Empire from a single test tube, his son, John Jack Dorrance Jr., was destined to be its silent, disciplined, and often reluctant guardian. By the time Jack reached his academic and physical prime in the early 1940s, the Campbell Soup Company was no longer a mere industrial startup. It had evolved into a massive national institution, a multi-million-dollar machine that functioned with the rhythmic, cold precision of a Swiss watch. However, for Jack, this monumental inheritance was never a springboard for personal innovation or a playground for creative disruption. Instead, it was a heavy, suffocating mantle of stewardship. His father's 35-page will had effectively predetermined the entire trajectory of his existence before he had even graduated from Princeton. To ensure that Jack did not succumb to the softness that often plagues the second generation of industrial dynasties, the senior Dorrance had mandated a rigorous, decade-long apprenticeship that bordered on the ascetic. Jack was strictly forbidden from entering the executive mahogany suites through the front door. Instead, after serving with distinction as a captain in the Signal Corps during the brutal theater of World War II, he was ordered to report to the grimy, steam-choked factory floors of Camden, New Jersey. His task was to learn the business from the molecular level up, replicating the grueling path his father had taken decades earlier. This apprenticeship was not a superficial tour of the facilities. It was a masterclass in ground-up management and industrial humility. For over 10 long years, Jack labored in relative obscurity, his billionaire status hidden behind a grease-stained uniform. He served as a floor foreman, intimately learning the metallic tang of the high-speed canning lines and the thick, cloying aroma of simmering tomatoes in massive copper kettles. He moved through the Treasury Department, where he was forced to master the Byzantine financial structures of a private empire that answered to no one but a dead man's trust. He served as an assistant to a series of professional presidents, quietly observing how these seasoned, non-family executives navigated the rigid, often frozen constraints of the Dorrance legacy. This period of quiet labor was crucial for the company's stability in a post-war world. While other mid-century American conglomerates were chasing radical, often reckless diversification into unrelated industries, Campbell remained laser-focused on the twin pillars of efficiency and quality. Jack learned the fundamental truth of the family business. In the condensed soup industry, a fraction of a cent saved on the gauge of a tin can or a microscopic improvement in the sugar-to-acid ratio of a tomato crop translated into tens of millions of dollars in annual profit. He became the living, breathing embodiment of his father's condensed philosophy, minimizing waste, maximizing control, and stripping away any distraction that did not serve the core product. In 1954, Jack presided over what remains the most significant strategic pivot in the company's century-long history, the momentous decision to go public. On the surface, this move seemed to directly contradict his father's paranoid, lifelong distrust of outside investors and public scrutiny. However, the decision was driven by cold, fiscal necessity rather than a newfound desire for transparency. The catastrophic tax war of 1930 and the increasing complexity of estate planning for a burgeoning web of Dorrance heirs meant that the family desperately needed a definitive market valuation for their shares. They required a mechanism to generate liquidity for tax obligations without technically violating the patriarch's never-sell mandate. By listing on the New York Stock Exchange, the Campbell Soup Company transitioned from a medieval family fiefdom into a modern, publicly traded corporation. Yet Jack ensured it was a public company in name only. Through a series of intricate, interlocking family trusts, the Dorrance kin maintained a suffocating majority of the voting stock. Jack's strategy was clear. Wall Street could buy the dividends, but they could never buy the steering wheel. He remained the undisputed chairman, and the 35-page ghost of his father remained the ultimate corporate charter, ensuring that the family's iron grip on the company's soul remained unyielding. Under Jack's steady, if intensely conservative hand, Campbell's became the undisputed monarch of the American convenience food revolution. The 1950s saw the brand move from the humble pantry into the very heart of the American cultural zeitgeist. In 1955, the company's test kitchen, operating under the brilliant direction of home economist Dorcas Riley, invented the green bean casserole. By utilizing Campbell's condensed cream of mushroom soup as a primary binder, this simple, 6-ingredient recipe transformed a standalone product into an indispensable culinary tool. It was a stroke of marketing genius that Jack recognized and fully weaponized. It ensured that Campbell's wasn't just a meal for the sick or the hurried. It was the structural foundation of the American holiday feast, a cultural ritual that guaranteed seasonal demand for decades. Simultaneously, Jack oversaw a calculated expansion into the nascent frozen food sector with the acquisition of Swanson in 1955, introducing the TV dinner to a nation increasingly captivated by the glowing small screen. He was scaling the empire to unprecedented heights, but he was doing so by meticulously following a pre-written script. He was the ultimate maintenance manager, a man who viewed corporate success primarily as the absolute absence of failure. However, the internal psychological toll of this lifelong stewardship was profound and devastating. Jack lived his life in a state of constant, low-grade terror. The high-profile kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby in the 1930s had left a permanent, jagged scar on the psyche of the American industrial elite. As the reigning Earl of Soup, Jack felt like a perennial moving target for every kidnapper and fortune hunter in the country. He was notoriously obsessed with security, surrounding his family with an invisible wall of bodyguards and armored transport, a direct psychological scar from the Lindbergh kidnapping that haunted the American elite. He retreated to Cedar Crest, his magnificent and isolated French Norman estate in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, which he meticulously fortified into a private sanctuary. There, far away from the prying eyes of the public and even his own restless shareholders, he amassed a secret art collection of staggering value, worth over $120 million. Masterpieces by Picasso, Monet, and Manet hung in silent rooms that few outsiders were ever permitted to see. This was the tragic paradox of Jack Dorrance. He was the public face of one of the world's most populous and comforting brands, a man whose product sat in every humble kitchen in the land. Yet he lived a life of such insulated luxury and intense, paranoid secrecy that he became a complete stranger to the very people he fed. He was a man who legally owned the world, but was psychologically forbidden from ever truly stepping outside the long, unyielding shadow cast by his father's 35-page will. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the strategic landscape of the American food industry began to shift beneath the feet of the Campbell Soup Company. For decades, the formula of one product, one price, one family had yielded unparalleled stability. But under Jack Dorrance's increasingly detached and insulated leadership, the very discipline that had built the empire began to transform into a dangerous form of corporate inertia. Jack was a man of the post-war era, a believer in steady, incremental growth and the absolute sanctity of the brand. He viewed radical change not as an opportunity, but as a threat to the delicate equilibrium established by his father's 35-page will. While competitors like Kraft, Heinz, and General Mills were aggressively diversifying into global conglomerates and experimenting with high-tech food processing, Campbell remained tethered to its red and white past. The company was profitable, but it was becoming a sleeping giant, a massive industrial machine that was slowly losing its connection to a new generation of American consumers who were beginning to demand fresh alternatives to the condensed lifestyle. The internal governance of Campbell during this period was characterized by a profound strategic paralysis. Because the Dorrance family still controlled a massive, suffocating block of the voting stock, the professional board of directors functioned more like a royal court than a modern oversight body. Jack, who had spent over 20 years as chairman, rarely faced a dissenting voice. His word was final, but his word was often a whisper of more of the same. This created a culture of extreme risk aversion. Every new product launch or potential acquisition had to be weighed against the potential impact on the family's quarterly dividends, the lifeblood of the sprawling network of Dorrance heirs. By the mid-1970s, there were dozens of descendants, many of whom had never stepped foot in a factory, yet whose entire lifestyle depended on the ironclad commands of a will written in 1930. The company was no longer just a business. It was a massive $10 billion welfare system for a single family, and Jack was its increasingly weary paymaster. In 1980, the company reached a quiet but critical breaking point. The dime soup era was long gone, swallowed by the stagflation of the 1970s, and the core condensed soup business was showing signs of fatigue. Jack, perhaps recognizing his own limitations or perhaps simply exhausted by the decades of stewardship, began to cede some operational control to outside executives. However, he remained the ultimate gatekeeper, a man whose presence in the Camden headquarters was more symbolic than active. He would arrive in his secure, heavily guarded vehicle, spend a few hours in his office surrounded by his secret art catalogs, and retreat to the safety of Cedar Crest. This detachment created a dangerous power vacuum. Within the family, a new generation of heirs, the grandchildren of John Thompson Dorrance, were reaching maturity. Unlike Jack, they had not served in the Signal Corps or labored on the factory floor for a decade. They were ranchers in Wyoming, socialites in New York, and expatriates in Europe. To them, the never-sell mandate was no longer a sacred duty. It was a financial cage that prevented them from accessing the billions locked away in Campbell's stock. The year 1984 marked the definitive end of the Jack Dorrance era. In a move that stunned the investment community and his own family, Jack walked into the annual shareholders meeting and announced his resignation as chairman in a single, offhand sentence. There was no grand farewell, no detailed succession plan, and no explanation. It was the act of a man who had spent 40 years guarding a ghost and had finally decided to let go of the keys. He remained on the board, but the Gilded Cage had lost its primary jailer. 5 years later, on April 9th, 1989, Jack died of a heart attack at his home in Gladwin. His death triggered a catastrophic unlocked inheritance. Overnight, the intricate trusts dissolved, and the direct ownership of approximately 1/3 of the Campbell Soup Company passed into the hands of his 3 children, Ipy, Mary Alice, and Bennett. The aftermath of Jack's passing revealed the true cost of his insulated management style. He had imparted almost nothing to his children about the inner workings of the multi-billion-dollar empire they now owned. He had shielded them from the dirty reality of the business so thoroughly that they were essentially strangers to their own wealth. They inherited a company that was a global icon but a strategic mess, undervalued by the market, bloated with underperforming side businesses, and surrounded by predatory competitors who smelled blood in the water. The 35-page will had successfully kept the company in the family for nearly 60 years, but it had failed to prepare the family for the company. As the 9 Dorrance cousins gathered to decide the future of the empire, they found themselves standing at the edge of a precipice. The unified front that John Thompson Dorrance had engineered was about to shatter, and the first blow would come from the most unlikely place, a cattle ranch in Wyoming, where an heir named Ipy was already drafting his own plan for freedom. The death of John Jack Dorrance Jr. on April 9, 1989, did not merely signal the end of a long, disciplined, and intensely private chairmanship. It acted as the definitive demolition charge that finally shattered the monolithic unity John Dorrance Sr. had spent an entire lifetime constructing. For nearly 60 consecutive years, the 35-page will had functioned as a corporate iron lung, keeping the Campbell Soup Company alive, stable, and firmly family-controlled through sheer, unyielding legal force. But the inheritance that Jack's 3 children, Ipy, Mary Alice, and Bennett, along with their 6 cousins received, was no longer the well-oiled, undisputed industrial machine of the mid-century. It was a strategic relic of a bygone era. The Gilded Cage had been unlocked by the biological inevitability of death, but the heirs who stepped out were not a unified front of industrial titans ready to lead. Instead, they were a fragmented clan of 9 cousins, deeply divided by disparate geographies, radically different lifestyles, and fundamentally conflicting visions of what their inherited wealth actually meant in a modern world. The era of the reigning earl had vanished overnight. The era of the shareholder revolt from within had begun with a vengeance. The immediate crisis facing the family was driven by a stark, cold financial reality that Jack had spent decades successfully obscuring through his insulated management style. The company's stock was chronically and dangerously undervalued. In the late 1980s, an aggressive era defined by barbarians at the gate, leveraged buyouts, and hostile takeovers, Wall Street looked at Campbell Soup and saw a literal gold mine being managed with the mindset of a corner grocery store. The core condensed soup business, the very heart of the empire, was stagnating as consumer tastes shifted toward fresh alternatives. Profit margins were being ruthlessly squeezed by more agile, technologically advanced competitors, and the company's balance sheet was bloated with a series of underperforming, non-core diversifications in frozen foods, pet foods, and experimental restaurant chains that Jack had acquired over the years but never fully integrated into a cohesive strategy. For the dissident branches of the family, those cousins who lived thousands of miles from the steam-filled factories of Camden and felt zero sentimental attachment to the red and white historical legacy, the Campbell stock was no longer a badge of honor. It was a golden goose that had simply stopped laying enough eggs. They were worth billions on paper, yet their actual spendable cash flow was strictly limited to quarterly dividends dictated by a conservative board. They wanted out of the soup business, and they wanted the massive premium price that only a total, scorched earth sale of the company to a global giant could provide. This internal friction and thirst for liquidity birthed one of the most bizarre, clandestine, and strategically significant episodes in American corporate history: Project Toad. Remarkably, this plan did not emerge from the polished mahogany of a high-powered Manhattan boardroom, but rather from the casual, elite social circles that the modern Dorrance heirs now inhabited as global socialites. In early 1989, driven by a desire for liquidity, the dissident branches of the family initiated clandestine discussions with investment bankers, exploring a massive merger with Quaker Oats to bypass the stagnant traditionalism of the Camden board. That neighbor happened to have intimate ties to the senior leadership of Quaker Oats. From this seemingly innocuous high-altitude conversation, a massive, secret proposal materialized with startling speed. The plan, codenamed Project Toad, envisioned a colossal merger between Campbell Soup and Quaker Oats. If successful, the transaction would have forged the second-largest food conglomerate in the United States, surpassed in scale only by the diversified tobacco and food behemoth Philip Morris. It was a deal designed to create a global powerhouse, but it carried a hidden price tag for the Dorrance legacy. To the analytical eyes of Wall Street analysts, Project Toad looked like a brilliant piece of strategic consolidation, a way to marry Campbell's dominant shelf presence with Quaker's innovative marketing and distribution. But to the loyalist branch of the family, led with fierce determination by Bennett Dorrance and his influential cousin George Strawbridge, the proposal was nothing less than a corporate Trojan horse. The merger would have necessitated shifting the historic corporate headquarters from the soot-stained, symbolic soil of Camden to the neutral ground of Chicago. More crucially, it would have fundamentally and permanently diluted the family's dynastic power. By merging with a public entity of Quaker's immense size, the Dorrance family would have watched their majority, controlling stake evaporate into a mere minority position. They would no longer be the sovereign masters of their own house. They would be transformed into mere passengers on someone else's ship, subject to the whims of outside directors and public market pressures. When Bennett and George discovered that these high-level negotiations were occurring behind their backs and without their formal consent, they reacted with the same fierce, protective, and territorial instinct that their grandfather, John Sr., would have recognized and admired. They didn't just express disagreement. They moved to kill the deal with a surgical, cold finality that stunned the pro-merger faction. The abrupt collapse of Project Toad in late 1989 did not bring the expected peace to the family. Instead, it ignited a corporate Cold War that finally spilled over into the public record and the courtrooms. Three dissident branches of the family, collectively holding approximately 17% of the total outstanding stock, took the unprecedented and aggressive step of filing formal 13D papers with the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. This was a public declaration of war, signaling their official intent to sell their shares to the highest bidder. They weren't just looking for a personal exit. They were strategically trying to force a for-sale sign onto the entire $10 billion company by creating a sense of inevitability. To lead their assault, they hired Arthur Lyman, the legendary and fearsome Manhattan attorney who had recently gained national fame for his razor-sharp role in the Iran-Contra hearings. Lyman's arrival at the Campbell headquarters in Camden was an unmistakable signal of escalation. His message to the Campbell board and the loyalist Dorrances was a chilling, unambiguous ultimatum. Either the company immediately found a radical way to satisfy the dissidents' thirst for liquidity and aggressive growth, or he would proceed to dismantle the empire brick by brick through a forced public auction. The 35-page will, which for 60 years had been an unbreakable shield against the outside world, was now being used as a jagged weapon in a high-stakes game of financial chicken, with the future of an American icon hanging in the balance. The formal, public rebellion by the dissident Dorrance heirs, represented by the legendary and fearsome Manhattan attorney Arthur Lyman, forced the Campbell Soup Company into a state of agonizing existential reckoning. By the dawn of 1990, it had become painfully clear to the loyalist faction that the Gilded Cage could no longer be maintained through the traditional tools of silence, secrecy, and ancestral duty. The board of directors, caught in a terrifying vice between the fierce, hereditary loyalty of Bennett Dorrance and the aggressive, liquidity-driven demands of the cousins who wanted to cash out, realized that the only way to save the company from a predatory hostile takeover or a catastrophic forced liquidation was to find a leader who could deliver miraculous and immediate financial results. They didn't need a family steward or a cautious administrator. They needed a corporate mercenary. They found that man in David Johnson, a charismatic, high-energy Australian executive who had recently orchestrated a stunning, headline-grabbing turnaround at Gerber Products. Johnson didn't just walk into the Camden headquarters. He stormed the gates, carrying an explicit mandate to prioritize shareholder value above every other consideration, including the 35-page ghost of John Dorrance Sr. David Johnson's arrival marked the definitive, unsentimental end of the gentlemanly era of Campbell Soup management. He understood with surgical clarity that to satisfy the dissident heir's unquenchable thirst for a higher stock price, he had to perform a radical financial condensation that mirrored the founder's original chemical process. If John Sr. had stripped water from the soup to save on shipping costs, David Johnson would strip the perceived fat from the corporate balance sheet to artificially inflate the earnings per share. He launched an aggressive scorched earth restructuring program that was as cold in its calculation as it was efficient in its execution. He viewed the company's sprawling century-old infrastructure not as a proud historical legacy to be preserved, but as a collection of stranded assets and operational inefficiencies. His leadership philosophy was brutally simple. If a factory, a regional brand, or an individual employee did not contribute to a direct, double-digit increase in the stock price within a fiscal quarter, they were considered obsolete and expendable. The most painful, traumatic, and symbolic act of this new mercenary regime occurred in late 1990, the permanent and controversial closure of Plant No. 1 in Camden. This was not merely another factory in a global portfolio. It was the sacred birthplace of the entire empire, the very site where John Dorrance Sr. had labored in a white coat to perfect the condensed formula in 1897. For nearly a century, the thick, savory smell of simmering tomatoes emanating from Plant No. 1 had defined the sensory identity of Camden, New Jersey. It was the beating heart of the community, providing stable, multi-generational employment to thousands of local families who viewed the company as a lifetime partner. But to David Johnson's spreadsheet-driven mind, the plant was nothing more than an inefficient, high-cost relic trapped in a decaying urban center with high taxes and aging machinery. Despite passionate, tearful protests from the local community, labor unions, and even some sentimental segments of the Dorrance family, Johnson ordered the heavy iron gates locked for good. The closure resulted in the immediate loss of 2,800 jobs and sent a chilling, unambiguous message to the remaining heirs. The family name no longer provided sanctuary or social responsibility. The company was now a cold, profit-driven machine, and the historic soil of Camden was officially being abandoned in favor of lower-cost, non-union facilities in the South and Midwest. Johnson's scorched earth tactics worked with a terrifying mathematical efficiency that stunned the market. He aggressively raised product prices, slashed regional marketing budgets that had been sacred for decades, and sold off nearly a dozen non-core businesses that Jack Dorrance had acquired during his conservative tenure. Within his first 24 months, Campbell's stock price nearly tripled. For the dissident heirs, it was the ultimate dream come true. Their individual net worth plummeted into the stratosphere of wealth, and the internal pressure to sell the entire company began to ease as they watched their quarterly dividends swell to record levels. But this financial triumph came at a profound and perhaps irreversible cultural cost. The company had lost its ancestral soul, the intense scientific pride that John Thompson Dorrance had instilled. The belief that Campbell's was a social contract for quality and consistency was being systematically replaced by a short-term, almost pathological obsession with quarterly earnings reports. The Loyalist branch, led by a quiet but horrified Bennett Dorrance, watched the transformation with a mixture of financial relief and spiritual dread. They had saved the company from the external threat of Project Toad, but they had handed the keys to a man who was dismantling the very moral and physical foundations upon which their grandfather had built the dynasty. By 1991, the Cold War within the Dorrance family had reached a temporary, uneasy, and fragile truce. The dissidents were now far too wealthy to continue their public complaints, and the Loyalists were technically still in control of the board's voting bloc. However, the most profound and quiet transformation was taking place in the mind of the eldest heir, John I.P. Dorrance III. As he watched the clinical destruction of Plant No. 1 and the shifting, mercenary values of the company his father had died protecting, I.P. realized that the golden shackle was still tightly fastened around his neck, even if the cage was now constructed of a much higher and shinier grade of gold. He saw with crystalline clarity that the American tax code remained the ultimate, patient predator, waiting in the shadows to devour more than half of the massive wealth David Johnson was so aggressively creating for the next generation. It was in this superheated atmosphere of corporate upheaval, urban abandonment, and family fragmentation that IP made a decision that would eventually stun the global financial world. He realized that to truly be free of the soup ghost, he would have to do more than just sell his shares. He would have to renounce his very identity as an American. The rebellion was no longer about the company's strategic direction. It was about the heir's ultimate survival in a world that no longer respected the 35-page will. By the early 1990s, the Campbell Soup Company had become a paradox of late 20th century capitalism. On the glowing monitors of Wall Street, the company was a spectacular triumph. Under CEO David Johnson's Australian whirlwind leadership, the stock price had ascended with the trajectory of a rocket, and profit margins were reaching historical peaks. However, within the red brick corridors of the company's remaining facilities and the increasingly fractured family meetings of the Dorrance heirs, a darker reality was beginning to take hold. The financial condensation that had satisfied the dissident cousins' thirst for liquidity was systematically eroding the company's soul. The 35-page ghost of John Thompson Dorrance was being exorcised, not by a change in the will, but by a change in values. The company was no longer an institution dedicated to the social contract of quality. It was becoming a cold, high-velocity machine designed for the singular purpose of quarterly earnings optimization. David Johnson's restructuring was not a one-time event. It was a continuous, relentless purge. Following the traumatic closure of Plant No. 1 in Camden, Johnson turned his sights on the company's middle management and its research and development, R&D, departments. He viewed the layers of seasoned executives, many of whom had served under Jack Dorrance for decades, as corporate barnacles that slowed the ship's speed. He initiated a series of efficiency audits that resulted in the departure of hundreds of long-term employees, stripping the company of its institutional memory. The scientific rigor that John Thompson Dorrance had established in 1897 was being replaced by marketing rigor. Money that had once been earmarked for agricultural research and the perfection of the condensed formula was now being diverted into aggressive, short-term advertising campaigns and high-pressure sales tactics. The product remained the same, but the internal culture of stewardship was being replaced by a culture of survival. This shift created a profound psychological crisis for the loyalist branch of the family, particularly for Bennett Dorrance and Mary Alice Dorrance Malone. They had spent their lives believing that the Campbell Soup Company was a sacred trust, a legacy to be guarded with the same intensity Jack Dorrance had shown. But as they sat in board meetings and watched Johnson dismantle the company's history for the sake of a few points on the stock ticker, they realized they were in a devil's bargain. To keep the dissident cousins from forcing a total sale of the company, they had to allow Johnson to destroy the very things that made the company worth keeping. They were saving the equity, but they were losing the empire. The unified front that their grandfather had mandated was now a hollow shell, held together only by the soaring value of the shares. The impact of this erosion was felt most acutely in the relationship between the company and its birthplace. Camden, New Jersey, once the soup capital of the world, was now a city in mourning. The closure of Plant No. 1 had left a jagged hole in the local economy, but the psychological wound was deeper. For generations, the Dorrance family had been the benevolent, if distant, aristocrats of Camden. Now, they were seen as the absentee landlords who had abandoned the city at its lowest point. This sense of betrayal began to seep into the family's own self-perception. They were no longer the soup kings. They were simply the ultra-wealthy, a group of individuals whose primary connection to each other was a shared tax liability. The social cohesion of the Dorrance dynasty was evaporating, condensed into a series of individual brokerage accounts. It was during this period of cultural decline that the internal tension between the cousins reached a boiling point regarding the never-sell mandate. The 35-page will had theoretically been bypassed by the 1954 IPO, but the spirit of the mandate still governed the family's behavior. However, the dissidents, emboldened by David Johnson's success, began to openly discuss the unthinkable, a total exit. They argued that the stock price was at its apex and that the soup business was a dinosaur in an era of fresh produce and health-conscious eating. They saw the company as a mature asset to be harvested, not a legacy to be tended. This was the environment in which I.P. Dorrance, the eldest grandson, began his quiet, meticulous preparation for his own great escape. He saw that the company was no longer the fortress his father had guarded. It was a target. And he realized that if he didn't act soon, the American government would be the ultimate beneficiary of his grandfather's ambition. The rebellion of 1989 had evolved from a fight for direction into a race for the exit. By 1993, the financial trajectory of the Campbell Soup Company, steered by David Johnson's relentless focus on bottom-line efficiency, had reached an altitude that was both exhilarating and terrifying for the Dorrance heirs. The stock price was no longer just a number on a ledger. It was a massive, glowing target. For John I.P. Dorrance III, the eldest son of Jack and the primary steward of the family's senior line, this soaring valuation brought a profound sense of fiscal vertigo. He was watching his net worth swell into the hundreds of millions, yet he felt more like a prisoner than a tycoon. The 35-page will of his grandfather had successfully kept the company together for over 60 years, but it had also trapped the family's wealth in a single, vulnerable asset. I.P., who had spent 15 years living the unvarnished, rugged life of a Wyoming rancher, possessed a fundamental distrust of the complex, predatory systems of the eastern seaboard and the federal government. He saw that while David Johnson was busy condensing the company for profit, the American Internal Revenue Service, IRS, was busy sharpening its knives for the ultimate harvest. The fatal flaw in the family's long-term survival strategy was the American estate tax. Under the laws of the early 1990s, the federal government claimed a staggering 55% of any large estate upon the owner's death. To I.P., this was not mere taxation, it was a state-sponsored dismemberment of his grandfather's life work. He performed the grim mathematics of his own mortality and realized that when he passed away, his children would be forced to sell more than half of their inheritance just to pay the tax bill. This would effectively end the Dorrance family's control of Campbell Soup forever. The irony was suffocating. The very never-sell mandate that was intended to preserve the legacy was now the very thing that ensured its destruction by the taxman. I.P. realized that to save the fortune, he would have to commit the ultimate act of financial treason. He would have to break the unity of the family and the country. His decision-making process was as meticulous and quiet as his father's art collecting. He began to study the global landscape of tax havens and citizenship alternatives. He didn't want to just hide money in a Swiss bank. He wanted to move his entire legal existence outside the reach of the IRS. He looked to Ireland, a country that was then aggressively courting the global ultra-wealthy with favorable tax laws for expatriates. In Ireland, the estate tax was a mere 2%, a dramatic and life-changing contrast to the 55% in the United States. But the price of this tax sanctuary was high. To qualify, he would have to formally and legally renounce his American citizenship. He would have to stand before a consular official, hand over his blue passport, and swear that he was no longer a citizen of the country where his grandfather had built the American dream in a can. The internal tension within the family during this period was electric. While Bennett Dorrance and Mary Alice remained committed to their roles as the guardians of Camden, I.P. was increasingly viewed as a ghost heir. He attended board meetings, but his mind was already in the emerald fields of Dublin. He began a quiet process of asset liquidation, preparing his Wyoming ranch for transfer to his sons and shifting his personal holdings into international accounts. He was applying his grandfather's principle of condensation to his own life, stripping away the water of his American identity to preserve the flavor of his wealth. He knew that the moment he acted, he would be branded a traitor by the press and perhaps even by his own kin. But to I.P., the true betrayal would be allowing the government to dismantle the empire his father and grandfather had sacrificed their lives to build. In late 1994, the plan was ready for execution. I.P.'s departure was not just a personal move. It was a seismic event for the Campbell Soup Company. As the largest individual shareholder, his renunciation of citizenship meant that a massive block of the company's equity was now expatriated. It signaled to the world that the Dorrance family's 100-year bond with America was officially broken. The gilded cage had not been opened by a rebellion of the poor, but by a flight of the rich. I.P. was about to become the most famous tax refugee in American history, proving that in the end, The only thing more powerful than John Dorrance's 35-page will was the human desire to be free from the shadow of the state. He was leaving behind the smoke of Camden for the mists of Ireland, carrying with him the golden shackle that he had finally learned how to pick. In the gray, damp chill of November 1994, a quiet but monumental act of legal severance took place that would forever stain the historical tapestry of the Campbell Soup Company. John Thompson Ip Dorrance III, the eldest grandson of the founder and the man who technically occupied the throne of the family's senior line, walked with deliberate steps into the American Embassy in Dublin, Ireland. He was not there to perform a routine diplomatic task or to renew a tourist visa for his beloved Wyoming ranch. He was there to execute a ritual of ultimate detachment. By formally and irrevocably renouncing his American citizenship, Ip was not merely surrendering a blue passport. He was surgically cutting the umbilical cord that had tied his staggering multi-million-dollar fortune to the insatiable appetite of the United States Treasury for nearly a century. This move, planned with the icy, calculated precision of a laboratory experiment, sent a seismic shock through the corporate boardrooms in Camden and the elite, limestone-clad social circles of the Philadelphia Main Line. The son of the reigning Earl of Soup had officially become the world's most prominent tax refugee. In doing so, he had signaled to the world that the golden shackle of his grandfather's 35-page will was finally, and perhaps violently, broken. The strategic and fiscal rationale for Ip's flight to the Emerald Isle was rooted in a brutal, inescapable mathematical reality that the Dorrance family had ignored for too long. As the individual owner of approximately 10.7% of the total outstanding equity in the Campbell Soup Company, Ip was sitting on a mountainous pile of unrealized capital gains. Under the aggressive American tax statutes of the mid-1990s, the biological inevitability of his eventual death would have triggered a federal estate tax of a staggering 55%. For Ip, the cold, hard logic of the spreadsheet was clear. His choice was between preserving half of his ancestors' life work for the benefit of the U.S. government, or preserving 98% of it for the direct benefit of his own children and their future. Ireland, which was then aggressively rebranding itself as the Celtic Tiger, offered a fiscal sanctuary where the estate tax for wealthy, non-resident expatriates was a mere 2%. To Ip, this move was not a betrayal of his patriotic identity, but rather the ultimate fulfillment of his duty to his own bloodline. He was applying the ultimate form of condensation, stripping away the water of his American national identity to distill and preserve the maximum amount of financial flavor for the future of the Dorrance name. However, the physical and psychological transition from a rugged Wyoming cattle rancher to a refined Irish citizen was far more than a simple exercise in bureaucratic paperwork. To satisfy the relentless scrutiny of the IRS and prove that his departure was a permanent change of life rather than a temporary tax-dodging sham, Ip had to fundamentally restructure his entire existence. He moved into a magnificent, multi-million-dollar Georgian townhouse in the affluent Ballsbridge district of Dublin, a residence designed to broadcast permanence and high society integration. He established a new international social orbit, far removed from the industrial soot of Camden or the dusty plains of Devil's Tower. But the most psychologically taxing part of his new life was the rigid 120-day rule. To maintain his precious tax-exempt status, Ip was legally and strictly forbidden from spending more than 120 days a year on American soil. For a man whose core identity was deeply rooted in the vast, unpeopled open spaces of the American West, this was a form of gilded exile. He could still visit his beloved 18,000-acres ranch in Wyoming, which he had shrewdly transferred into a complex trust for his sons. But he now had to watch the calendar with the obsessive, paranoid care of a prisoner on a tether. Every single day spent on American soil was a day that risked triggering a billion-dollar tax liability. The reaction back in the corporate headquarters of Camden was a volatile mixture of profound embarrassment, public relations disaster, and strategic panic. The loyalist branch of the family, led with quiet desperation by Bennett Dorrance, found themselves in a strategically impossible position. They were still desperately trying to project an image of Campbell's as a wholesome, patriotic, and fundamentally American icon, the soup that had fed the troops in 2 world wars and provided the good emotional comfort of the traditional American home. Yet, their largest individual shareholder and the heir to the founder's name had effectively fled the country to avoid contributing even a cent more to its national treasury. David Johnson, the high-energy CEO who had worked so tirelessly to inflate the stock price, now found that his very success had provided IP with the financial jet fuel needed for his ultimate escape. The dissidents within the family, who had been clamoring for liquidity and an exit strategy since the death of Jack in 1989, viewed IP's move as the ultimate validation of their own desire to leave. If the eldest heir and the nominal head of the dynasty no longer believed in the long-term viability of staying tied to the American empire, why should they continue to remain prisoners of the 35-page will? By 1995, IP's Irish passport had become a global symbol for a new era of ultra-wealthy, mobile capital that knew no borders. He was no longer a soup king bound to the soil of New Jersey. He was a global sovereign investor. He began a quiet but systematic process of diversifying his holdings, moving away from the dangerous, single-stock dependency that had defined and constricted the lives of his father and grandfather. In doing so, he was finally breaking the spirit of the never-sell mandate, even if he had not yet executed the final, massive trade. He was preparing the ground for a total liquidation, a move that would permanently and irrevocably alter the ownership structure and the very soul of the Campbell Soup Company. IP had realized that in the late 20th century, true power did not come from owning a physical factory or a historic name. It came from the absolute mobility of capital and the ability to choose one's own master. He had successfully condensed his life and his liability into a portable fortune, leaving his cousins behind to ponder the remains of the gilded cage while he watched the sun set over the Irish Sea. A billionaire who had successfully traded his country for the absolute freedom of his fortune. The formal renunciation of his American citizenship in late 1994 was merely the psychological and legal prelude to John I.P. Dorrance III's final, definitive act of corporate severance. For 2 long years, he lived as a legal ghost in the eyes of the United States. A man who possessed $1 billion stake in an American cultural icon, but who could no longer legally call himself an American citizen. He had successfully moved his physical person and his legal residence, but the vast bulk of his power, his staggering 10.7% equity in the Campbell Soup Company, remained anchored in the custody accounts of Wall Street and subject to the underlying volatility of the American market. By 1996, the internal pressure within the Dorrance family had reached a terminal velocity. CEO. David Johnson's aggressive scorched earth, cost-cutting, and subsequent stock price inflation had created a valuation peak that the dissident cousins were desperate to harvest. IP, watching from the refined quiet of his Georgian townhouse in Dublin, realized that his personal process of condensation had reached its ultimate, irreversible phase. He was no longer interested in being the titular steward of a 35-page ghost. He craved the absolute, liquid freedom that only a total, surgical exit could provide. In November 1996, the global financial world was rocked by a transaction that signaled the symbolic and practical end of a century of monolithic family rule. In a single, seismic move that bypassed the traditional caution of the Dorrance lineage, IP executed the sale of his entire block of Campbell Soup shares. This was not a gradual, polite divestment or a strategic paring of his position to satisfy minor liquidity needs. It was a total, absolute liquidation of his ancestral birthright. The sale was valued at a staggering $720 million, a figure of such immense magnitude that it required the complex, synchronized coordination of multiple global investment banks to execute without triggering a total panic-driven collapse of the stock price. By selling his entire stake in one fell swoop, IP was performing the unthinkable. He was officially and publicly burning the never-sell mandate that his grandfather, John Thompson Dorrance, had intended to be an eternal, ironclad command. He had traded his historic seat at the table of the American industrial elite for a mountain of liquid cash that was now safely and permanently beyond the reach of the U.S. federal government and its 55% estate tax predator. The immediate aftermath of this $720 million liquidation created a profound and destabilizing power vacuum within the Campbell Soup Company's headquarters in Camden. For the first time since 1897, the senior line of the Dorrance family, the direct, firstborn descendants of the chemist who had invented condensed soup, no longer held a dominant, controlling voice in the firm's future direction. The golden shackle had been cut with a heavy blade, but in doing so, IP had also dismantled the unified psychological front that had protected the company from external corporate raiders for nearly 80 years. While his cousins Mary Alice and Bennett remained firmly on the board, holding on to their respective shares with a complex mixture of ancestral loyalty and growing dread, the family's collective, absolute grip was irrevocably weakened. IP's exit provided a definitive exit blueprint for the other restless heirs. Over the following decade, the family's total ownership began to steadily and visibly erode from a near monopoly to a mere minority influence. The empire was quite literally being diluted by the very liquid wealth it had spent a century creating. IP's new life as a global sovereign was a masterclass in the art of insulated, post-national luxury. He settled into a refined existence that spanned 3 continents but was anchored in the patriotic duty of no single nation. He spent his emerald summers in the cool, rain-washed mists of Ireland, where he was celebrated not as a tax refugee, but as one of the country's wealthiest resident investors and a vital source of prestige for the Celtic Tiger economy. During the brutal, bone-chilling North American winters, he retreated to Lyford Cay in the Bahamas, a private, high-security, gated enclave designed specifically for the global ultra-wealthy, where the very concept of income tax was treated as a foreign and unnecessary language. He had become the ultimate tax refugee, a man who had successfully and ruthlessly applied the scientific principles of his grandfather, separation, concentration, and purity, to the delicate art of wealth preservation. He had removed the water of national allegiance and the impurity of estate taxes, leaving behind a distilled, $720 million essence of pure, mobile capital. He was free, but he was also a man without a country, a billionaire whose primary identity was now defined solely by the speed and mobility of his assets rather than the soil beneath his feet. Back in the soot-stained factories of Camden and among the local families who had served the Dorrance dynasty for 4 generations, the sting of this final abandonment was felt with a quiet, bitter intensity. The man whose very name was synonymous with the city's industrial pride and its historical identity was now an expatriate living in a Georgian mansion 4,000 miles away. The social contract that John Sr. had envisioned, a private company serving a public good through stable employment and quality products, had been replaced by a global portfolio managed by offshore trustees and high-frequency algorithms. As IP watched the sun set over the dark waters of the Irish Sea, he likely felt no remorse. In his mind, he had saved his family's future from what he viewed as the predatory and inefficient reach of a bloated, overtaxing state. He had outsmarted both the 35-page will and the IRS. But in achieving this victory, he had proven the one uncomfortable truth that John Dorrance's scientific genius could never condense: the corrosive, solvent-like effect of massive wealth on the ancient ties that bind a family to its home and its history. The Soup King was dead. Long live the expatriate. John Thompson Dorrance III, known to his inner circle and eventually to a fascinated public simply as IP, was perhaps the most improbable and recalcitrant heir to an Eastern industrial dynasty in the annals of American business history. While his father, Jack, had been meticulously and almost painfully groomed within the stifling shadow of the Philadelphia Main Line and the industrial soot of Camden, IP's life took a radical, divergent path. This departure was fueled by the traumatic and high-profile divorce of his parents when he was just 19, a crack in the family facade that changed him forever. His mother, seeking a clean break from the Dorrance expectations, whisked him away to the elite, multilingual boarding schools of Switzerland. This provided him with a privileged but profoundly detached adolescence, far removed from the red and white soup cans that defined his lineage. When he finally returned to the United States, it was not to claim a plush leather seat at the Campbell Soup headquarters. Instead, he sought a landscape that possessed a different kind of purity, one that didn't smell of simmering sodium and corporate sycophancy. Like his siblings, he eventually enrolled at the University of Arizona, earning a degree in business. But the sterile, recirculated air of the modern boardroom held no aesthetic or spiritual appeal for him. Instead of returning to the East Coast to become a soup prince in a tailored suit, IP did something utterly unprecedented. He vanished into the rugged, uncompromising silence of the American West. In the early 1970s, Using the modest resources available to him at the time, IP purchased an expansive 18,000-acre cattle ranch near the stark, majestic phonolite monolith of Devil's Tower in northeastern Wyoming. It was a landscape characterized by vast, whispering shortgrass prairies, jagged rimrock, and winters so unforgiving they could freeze the breath in a man's lungs. This was a world away from the genteel, limestone-clad enclaves of Pennsylvania and the suffocating inherited weight of the Dorrance name. There, under the infinite high plains sky, he became a rancher in the most authentic and grueling sense of the word. He did not play at being a cowboy. He lived it. He raised Brangus cattle, a hardy, black-hided crossbreed perfectly suited for the temperature extremes of the Wyoming range. He personally branded his herd with the letters IPY, a rustic and shortened version of the childhood nickname he had acquired as a small boy when he struggled to pronounce the formal Roman numeral, the third, that followed his name. For 15 long years, IP lived the unvarnished, sunrise-to-sunset life of a working cattleman. He married Gundel Sock, and together they built a life defined by the rhythmic cycles of the seasons rather than the quarterly cycles of a fiscal year. Their home was a magnificent handcrafted 3-story chalet, filled with mounted game, Western art, and the quiet, hard-earned dignity of a life lived in intimate contact with the land. During this decade and a half of self-imposed exile, IP was comfortable but lived far below the astronomical wealth associated with the senior Dorrance legacy. His primary source of financial support was a respectable but relatively modest quarterly stipend of $100,000, disbursed from a trust established by his father. While this was a generous, upper-class sum by any ordinary American standard, it bore no true resemblance to the staggering multi-billion-dollar fortune that lay locked away in millions of shares of Campbell Soup stock. That wealth sat in the vaults of Camden, patiently accumulating massive dividends while awaiting the biological inevitability of Jack Dorrance's passing. IP was, quite literally, a billionaire in waiting. Yet he chose to spend his physical prime fixing rusted barbed wire fences, managing the complex health of 1,000-head herd, and navigating the volatile, often heartless commodities markets of the American beef industry. He was a man who had successfully stripped away the chemical impurities of his corporate heritage, finding a sense of moral and physical purity in the harsh, honest, and often lonely labor of the Wyoming ranch. He was condensing his own character, far away from the diluted social scene of the Philadelphia elite. However, the biological clock of the Dorrance dynasty could not be stayed by the vast distance of the Wyoming plains. On April 9, 1989, when his father's heart finally failed, IP's reality shifted with a stunning, overnight abruptness that felt like a seismic shift in the earth beneath his boots. He was no longer just a rugged rancher with a respectable stipend. He was suddenly, astronomically, the individual owner of a stake in the Campbell Soup Company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His personal income surged from a comfortable salary to an astounding $87,000 a day in dividends alone, a cash flow so massive and unrelenting that it defied the comprehension of his closest neighbors in the sparsely populated hills of Wyoming. But instead of remaining in his western sanctuary and simply cashing the checks, IP surprised the entire corporate world, the jaded analysts of Wall Street, and his own fractured, bickering family. He did not immediately liquidate his shares to retreat further into the wilderness. Instead, the rancher heir returned to Camden with a vengeance, joining the Campbell board of directors with an intensity and a hands-on, operational commitment that few expected from a man who had spent 15 years in the company of cattle rather than high-priced consultants. IP quickly proved to be far more than a mere figurehead or a passive trustee. He brought the rugged, cut-to-the-chase pragmatism of the ranching world into the stagnant, overly polite atmosphere of the company's New Jersey headquarters. He was unpredictable, intensely focused on details, and deeply, almost obsessively engaged in the actual operational machinery of the empire. He famously utilized his own personal wealth to charter flights across the globe, personally inspecting the minute details of factory operations in Hong Kong, the vegetable supply chains in Spain, and the processing plants in Argentina. He didn't want to just stare at sanitized balance sheets in a boardroom. He wanted to smell the steam of the production lines and speak directly to the managers on the factory floor about yield and efficiency. One fellow director concisely encapsulated IP's fervent dedication by stating that for the rancher, The preservation and excellence of the company was no longer a business interest. It was a sacred mission. He became the primary architect of the family's fierce resistance against external takeovers, most notably using his considerable influence to help scuttle the clandestine Project Toad merger that would have erased the family's name from the masthead. He had transformed from a fugitive of the family name into its most fierce and active protector. Yet, even as he fought with everything he had to keep the company within the family, he was beginning to recognize a relentless, structural adversary that no amount of Western grit or ancestral loyalty could overcome: the predatory and inescapable nature of the American tax code. The internal transformation of John I.P. Dorrance III from the company's most fervent protector to its most famous expatriate was not a sudden act of betrayal, but a slow, calculated process of rancher's pragmatism. As he sat in the wood-paneled boardroom in Camden throughout the early 1990s, I.P. began to view the Campbell Soup Company through the same lens he used to evaluate his Wyoming cattle operations. He saw a magnificent herd that was being systematically bled dry, not by market competitors, but by a parasitic relationship with the federal government. For every dollar of efficiency he squeezed out of a factory in Buenos Aires or a supply chain in Hong Kong, he was acutely aware that 55 cents of that value was already earmarked for the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, upon his eventual death. To a man who had spent 15 years laboring in the honest, rugged economy of the West, where you kept what you earned through sweat and grit, the American estate tax felt like a legalized form of rustling. The Project Toad crisis had been a watershed moment for I.P. While he had successfully fought to keep the company independent, the experience revealed a terrifying vulnerability: his own family. He looked across the boardroom table and saw cousins who were increasingly disconnected from the industrial soul of the business. To them, the red and white labels were just coupons for a luxury lifestyle. I.P. realized that the golden shackle of his grandfather's 35-page will was failing. It could dictate who owned the stock, but it could not dictate the character of the owners. He foresaw a future where the family's majority control would be dismantled not by a hostile predator, but by the slow, inevitable erosion of inheritance taxes and the lack of a unified successor. He refused to let his life's work and the accumulated genius of 3 generations be liquidated to fund a government bureaucracy he deeply distrusted. The decision to expatriate was executed with the same quiet, tactical precision I.P. used to move cattle across a winter range. He didn't consult the family's traditional East Coast advisors. He sought out international tax specialists who understood the nuances of global mobility. He chose Ireland not for its culture, though he appreciated its rugged beauty, but for its status as a fiscal sanctuary. In Dublin, the Celtic tiger was roaring, offering a 2% estate tax that stood in staggering contrast to the 55% American Leviathan. In late 1994, I.P. made the journey to the American Embassy in Dublin. In a quiet room, far from the steam of the Camden plants, the rancher heir handed over his blue passport. It was an act of financial secession. By renouncing his citizenship, I.P. was effectively taking his 10.7% stake in the Campbell Soup Company, then worth approximately $700 million, and moving it into a legal fortress where the IRS could no longer reach it. The fallout was immediate and explosive. The American press branded him a tax traitor, and his loyalist cousins in Philadelphia felt the sting of a public relations nightmare. But I.P., true to his Wyoming roots, remained stoic. He understood a fundamental truth that his Eastern relatives had forgotten. True sovereignty comes from the ability to walk away. He established a new life in a magnificent Georgian mansion in Dublin's Ballsbridge district, but he kept his heart in the high plains. He continued to manage his Wyoming ranch through a series of complex trusts, navigating the 120-day rule with the precision of a navigator. He was a billionaire without a country, a man who had successfully condensed his identity to its most essential financial essence. He had traded his national allegiance for the absolute preservation of his family's capital. In 1996, I.P. executed the final blow to the Gilded cage. Recognizing that the company's stock was at an all-time high under David Johnson's aggressive management, he liquidated his entire holding. The $720 million sale was the largest single divestment in the family's history. It was the moment the never-sell mandate died. I.P. didn't just leave the company. He burned the bridge behind him. He took the liquid essence of a century of soup-making and vanished into the global elite of the Bahamas and Ireland. He had proven that while his grandfather could control the company from the grave, he could not control a grandson who knew how to survive in the wilderness. The rancher from Wyoming had finally found the ultimate pasture, one where the fences were made of offshore accounts and the herd was safe from the taxman's brand. He was no longer the heir to an empire. He was the architect of his own absolute freedom. The story of the Dorrance family and the Campbell Soup Company is the ultimate American paradox. It began with a scientific breakthrough in 1897 that aimed to simplify life for millions, and it ended in a complex legal and financial labyrinth that fractured a dynasty. John Thompson Dorrance was a master of chemistry who believed that by removing the water, he could preserve the essence. He applied this logic to his business, his taxes, and eventually to his children's lives through a 35-page will that acted as a high-pressure canning jar, meant to keep the family's wealth fresh and unified for eternity. But as any chemist knows, when you increase pressure and remove the natural elements of freedom and choice, the container eventually shatters. Today, the Campbell Soup Company remains a global icon, its red and white labels still haunting the shelves of every supermarket. But the golden shackle has long been broken. The family's majority control has dissolved into a fragmented collection of minority stakes and diversified portfolios. The historic plants in Camden are largely silent or repurposed, and the headquarters is managed by professional executives who answer to the relentless pressures of quarterly earnings and the shifting demands of the modern consumer rather than the ghost of a founder. The Dorrance heirs are scattered across the globe, some as quiet philanthropists in Pennsylvania, others as sovereign expatriates in tax havens. They possess the billions that John Sr. worked so hard to preserve, but they no longer possess the empire. The legacy of the Dorrances serves as a haunting reminder of the limits of control. You can condense soup, but you cannot condense the human spirit. You can write a 35-page will to guard a fortune, but you cannot protect a family from the changing tides of history, tax codes, and individual desire for freedom. In the end, the condensed empire proved that wealth, like soup, is best when it is allowed to circulate, when it is shared, diluted, and integrated into the world, rather than locked away in a gilded cage. As the steam rises from a bowl of soup in a million kitchens today, the ghost of John Dorrance Sr. perhaps finally understands the one formula he missed, that the only way to truly keep a legacy is to let it go.